Regarded as one of the most baffling enigmas from World War II, on the morning of the 16th of August 1942, two U.S. Navy pilots vanished without any clue from the cabin of their blimp. They were carrying out a standard patrol along the California coast. What might have led two exceptionally skilled soldiers, both in perfect mental and physical condition, to leave a perfectly functional aircraft while airborne? This narrative concerns the ghost blimp. World War II is arguably among the most recorded and re-examined conflicts in history. However, numerous incidents from that war are still hidden from the awareness of many Americans. It may come as a surprise that Japanese and German naval units carried out attacks near or upon the U.S. mainland, mainly targeting American vessels. These assaults were directed at American ships along both the Atlantic and Pacific coasts. A chain of subsequent occurrences would lead to the strange vanishing of two U.S. airship pilots later that August. Japanese submarine operations also caused another mysterious casualty on the 7th of December 1941. That incident involved several merchant mariners and soldiers far out at sea, just 10 minutes before the Pearl Harbor assault commenced. 1,200 miles distant, a Japanese I-class submarine emerged and began firing at the SS Cynthia Olsen. This vessel was a U.S. Army timber freighter halfway through its journey from Washington state to Hawaii. Following numerous rounds from the submarine's deck guns striking their target, the Olsen went down as the first American ship sunk by the Japanese Empire and the last that those on board would ever see. Japanese accounts indicate that the captain of the attacking submarine later came to the surface and gave food supplies to the American survivors in the lifeboats. Yet, even though the Olsen's radio operator stayed aboard and effectively broadcast their last location to adjacent vessels and coastal stations, none of the 35 crew members were ever spotted again. Before the assault on Oahu began, Japanese submarines had been stationed near the mouth of Pearl Harbor. The goal was to cut off any American ships trying to make their way to open sea. 3 days later, 9 of the 12 available Japanese submarines received orders to chase and destroy an American aircraft carrier. That carrier was heading toward the U.S. mainland. Subsequently, they were to proceed to key assault positions, harbor mouths, and maritime routes along the American coast. During the subsequent week, spanning December 18 to 24, Americans observed multiple Japanese assaults on U.S. merchant ships extremely close to the California coastline. The submarines stayed in the area, lurking along the shore until the final week of February. Over this period, at least 6 American merchant and cargo ships came under attack. Many of their crew members were killed or forced to leave their sinking vessels, some in lifeboats that were subsequently strafed by Japanese deck guns. Even though the Japanese originally intended to shell American coastal cities like Los Angeles, submarine commanders grew wary of the Americans' ever more precise anti-submarine countermeasures, which targeted only land-based objectives. The Elwood oil refinery, roughly 80 miles northwest of Los Angeles near Santa Barbara, was struck. Many Americans now worried about strikes on the mainland amid the unpredictable war. The U.S. Navy suggested to Congress that they create a lighter-than-air initiative for regular anti-submarine patrols along the coast and in harbors. These blimps carried 2 Mark 17 depth charges and a .30 caliber machine gun. They were fully capable of destroying any Japanese submarines they could find. By August 1942, airship patrols had become a frequent sight along the California coast. But on the late morning of August 16, a solitary swimmer got ready to go into the water. He was shocked to see a blimp emerge from the fading morning mist, flying perilously low above the sea directly toward him. Swiftly getting out of danger, he observed the airship hit the sand, then crash into a steep bank. Upon impact, one of the 2 depth charges detached. Freed from that weight, the blimp ascended and floated away from view. Soon, thousands of onlookers observed the damaged airship listing slowly across the San Francisco peninsula, its helium bag leaking. It finally came down, brushing against rooftops and power lines, before touching down on a street in Northeast Daly City. After chasing the drifting blimp, firefighters, police, and city officials reached the site promptly. Along with local residents and curious onlookers, they conducted an immediate search that left investigators puzzled. The airship had no crew aboard. The door was left latched open, and a microphone connected to an external loudspeaker hung from the open hatch. Other than engine damage from the multiple impacts, the vessel appeared normal. The engine was running, with the throttle placed at idle. The radio was switched on and functional. Inside the cabin, the life raft and 3 parachutes remained hanging on their hooks. No clear signs of criminal activity were found. The Blimp, known by its designation L8, had taken off from the nearby naval station Treasure Island. Just after 6 a.m. on that same day, the Blimp was flown by 2 7-year-old Lieutenant Ernest Cody and 3 2-year-old Ensign Charles Adams. Both were regarded as experienced pilots. The initial 90 minutes of the flight were routine, carrying them across the Golden Gate Bridge and over open sea toward the Farallon Islands. At 7:38 a.m., 30 miles offshore and just 4 miles from the islands, they transmitted their location. Minutes later, after detecting a suspicious oil slick that could signal a Japanese submarine, they notified their squadron headquarters of their plan to investigate. That was the final communication from either man. Crew members on 2 ships near the reported oil slick heard nothing further. Later, the cargo ship SS Albert Gallatin and the fishing trawler Daisy Gray provided their eyewitness descriptions. They did this because Cody and Adams had fallen into an unexplained radio silence. Around the same time, the Blimp's pilots had radioed about their examination of the oil slick. At 7 a.m., both ships observed 2 smoke flares being dropped from the airship into the sea. These flares were likely used to mark a point of interest, such as where an enemy submarine was located. That sub would then become a target for American bombers. The crew of the Gallatin instantly raised the alarm and took positions at their deck guns. They rapidly steered their vessel away from the area, cautious of a possible submarine. The Daisy Gray was positioned much nearer, allowing the first mate to spot both pilots inside the gondola and even make out their hair color. They promptly started hauling in their nets, expecting the Blimp to release a depth charge on an enemy submarine. No explosives were released. In fact, as they stayed and watched the airship, not a single member of the now highly attentive Daisy Gray crew noticed anything descending from it. They observed nothing beyond the first 2 flares. For more than an hour, they watched anxiously, some using binoculars. The Blimp kept circling the area at an altitude of 200 to 300 feet above the water. At one moment, it dropped to less than 30 feet over the waves. As though the crew sought a nearer view, crew members on the SS Gallatin, which was now leaving, reported that the airship appeared nearly resting on the water. Then, just after 9 a.m., L8 released ballast, ascended, and turned back toward San Francisco. Because airships routinely patrolled the coast, no observer found L8's behavior odd. However, that may have been the final sighting of Cody and Adams. For some unexplained reason, the pilots kept radio silence for that entire 90 minutes. Back at the base, their command was becoming increasingly worried. When the airship was seen departing the site of the reported oil slick, every plane nearby had already been alerted. Their orders were to watch for a possibly troubled Blimp and to report any observations right away. Additionally, 2 Kingfisher float planes were sent out to look for the airship. The sequence of L8's actions and sightings that followed is at the very least bewildering, as they become illogical when arranged in time order. This may be because of the utterly puzzling character of this incident. Alternatively, it might stem from potential changes in the numerous recounts of this tale over the past 80 years. A number of the existing news reports and TV shows that have featured this ghost Blimp story tend to skip over L8's location. It departed from the oil slick shortly after 9 a.m. A single swimmer witnessed it crashing into the seawall at Ocean Beach and releasing one of its depth charges around 11:15 a.m. That retelling of events would imply that, in that 2-hour span, L8 merely drifted 30 miles downwind, likely without any control. Because both pilots might have fallen out while the Blimp hovered over the oil slick, but this appears improbable for several reasons. Among the reasons is that the Blimp was observed flying under control, and there are indeed several reported sightings of it between those 2 moments. 1 hour and 30 minutes after leaving the oil slick at 10 a.m., the pilot of a Pan American Clipper aircraft spotted the Blimp. As it passed over the Golden Gate Bridge, everything looked normal. L8 seemed to be under command and making its way back toward Treasure Island. However, it's plausible that a P-38 pilot nearby also reported seeing it approaching the bridge around that time. No specific timestamp seems available for the P-38 pilot's report. Moreover, other versions of this narrative appear to add this sighting merely as an afterthought. In an apparent afterthought, the P-38 pilot supposedly gave the same account as the Clipper pilot. The blimp was operating normally, with nothing out of the ordinary. Assuming these two bridge sightings are accurate, L8's subsequent reported location becomes nearly incomprehensible. The Kingfisher float planes, likely still scanning along Late's designated path over open sea, may have been notified then that the blimp had been seen near the bridge, causing them to change course toward that area to see it personally. At 11 a.m., only 10 minutes after it was observed over the Golden Gate Bridge, one of the Kingfisher pilots finally detected the blimp. Oddly enough, L8 was nowhere close to where its earlier flight path should have placed it. The Kingfisher pilot added that the blimp was behaving anomalously. It was ascending through the overcast and vanishing into the clouds at nearly 2,000 feet when he sighted it. The weather conditions that day would have caused the blimp's automatic pressure release valves to engage between 2,100 and 2,500 feet. After reaching the maximum altitude and venting sufficient helium, the now deflated airship would then have descended. If this account is correct, the Kingfisher pilot's sighting is peculiar. Even though it had just been seen heading east over the Golden Gate Bridge toward Treasure Island, L8 seemed to have turned around. It was now nearly 15 miles southwest of the bridge, 3 miles out over the Pacific Ocean. Even though some minutes can be attributed to the delay in earlier radio communications, the reported times of these sightings and L8's inexplicable flight path shifts are seemingly impossible, as if the blimp had suddenly, either that it could travel at extremely high speeds, or that it could be simultaneously in two locations. When heading out to and returning from the Farallon Islands, each leg took 1 hour and 30 minutes, both starting shortly after 6. The outward journey went from shortly after 6 a.m. to 7 a.m., and the return journey lasted from shortly after 9 a.m. to 10 a.m. The blimp would have been moving at a modest cruising speed of about 20 miles per hour, at least during the initial leg out to the islands. For the pilots, maintaining such a speed makes sense, if only for fuel conservation. They likely aimed to go slowly enough to scan the water below for enemy submarines. Whether the pilots remained on board as the blimp returned to land remains unclear. However, the engines were later discovered set to idle. How the blimp sustained a steady 20 miles per hour during its return journey is uncertain, unless strong winds were present or it was actually under pilot control. Regardless, L8's top speed under ideal weather was just above 60 miles per hour. To cover 15 miles southwest of the Golden Gate Bridge in under 10 minutes, that would require a speed between 85 and nearly 100 miles per hour, an impossibility. If the Kingfisher pilot's account is correct, and L8 was 3 miles off Salada Beach at that moment, it then seemingly changed direction once more. Drifting more than 6 miles northeast, this part of the movement is presumably reliable. Strong winds could have driven the idling, deflated blimp inland until it finally hit Ocean Beach. Upon its crash in Daly City, the blimp had just 4 hours of fuel left. It had begun its patrol with a full 1-2 hour fuel supply. The sole logical explanation is that at some moment, a pilot deliberately released more than 30% of the airship's fuel. However, why was this action regarded as so abnormal? Unless the blimp urgently needed to ascend by rapidly and significantly boosting buoyancy, this major fuel release could account for the blimp's disappearance high into the clouds. Similar to a child's balloon, the fuel loss therefore happened between 10 and 11 a.m. At the same time, the airship mysteriously covered the impossible distance from the Golden Gate Bridge to 3 miles off Salada Beach. The added buoyancy might also be explained by the loss of the 2 crew members, though several eyewitness accounts seem to dispute that. Those witnesses reported seeing figures moving inside the gondola even after the blimp had deflated and was drifting out at sea. As people try to unravel this mystery, many lean toward the popular theory. For various potential reasons, at some point one of the men fell out of the gondola. This may have happened at the location of the oil slick. That could explain why the aircraft circled low above the water for more than an hour. The door was left open with a loudspeaker handset hanging out. The surviving pilot might then have been leaning out, using the loudspeaker to try to find, or to communicate with the man who had fallen into the water, and then the second man may have fallen. He either lost his hold on the gondola or fell while trying to locate and rescue his partner. The waters near the Farallon Islands seem to host one of the world's largest concentrations of great white sharks. These waters are arguably perilous for anyone who falls in, even if they survive the fall and wore a life jacket. While undeniably the most likely explanation, this theory starts to break down because of contradictory eyewitness accounts, particularly reports of the Blimp's seemingly controlled flight path back toward San Francisco. This was observed by the Daisy Gray and the pilots who saw the Blimp near the Golden Gate Bridge. Furthermore, some propose that the two flares were released not to indicate an enemy submarine, but rather to mark the spot where the first man fell, which seems logical. However, the Daisy Gray crew contradict this, stating that the flares were dropped at 7 a.m. Approximately the same time, one of the men was also contacting their base command to report the oil slick. Moreover, a journalist spoke with several people who saw the airship looking deflated while drifting aimlessly 50 feet above the water. At sea, no fewer than 2 different people observed its gradual drift toward the shore. These included a 17-year-old boy at an unspecified spot and a young woman on horseback near the beach, where the airship initially went down. Using binoculars, they said they spotted figures moving within the cabin. The woman reported she was fairly certain she saw no fewer than 3 individuals inside. Further contradictions arise from accounts, one originating from the golf course close to where the Blimp came down on the beach. It indicates a man was observed bailing out of L8 while it was still above the water. Additionally, the Navy released a statement declaring their inquiry found no chance that the men were aboard the aircraft at any point during its unmanned journey over land. A different hypothesis suggests the pilots actually noticed a Japanese enemy submarine and went down to inspect it. The speculation is that they were subsequently captured and either killed or taken as prisoners on the sub. The primary question is why they wouldn't have promptly released their depth charges instead of undertaking such a risky and apparently useless inspection. Moreover, if this theory holds, then who piloted the Blimp back to San Francisco as seen by the crew aboard the Daisy Gray? Also, the pilots who saw L8 approaching the bridge. According to yet another idea, the 2 men were caught in a romantic triangle with a mysterious woman. One killed the other in a fit of jealousy and then escaped when the airship made landfall. This explanation likewise appears to be an implausible melodrama. While the deliberate or accidental killing of one pilot might lend some plausibility to how one initially disappeared, it does not account for the testimonies of eyewitnesses. The peculiar maneuvers of the airship and the timing when the second pilot could have left the vessel are examined. If airborne, should this be even partly accurate, he might have leaped to his demise from remorse. Alternatively, he might have survived plunging into the sea. He could have then lived the remainder of his days in hiding, fearing retaliation. The most conflicting element of this latter hypothesis is the question of why the guilty pilot wouldn't have just claimed his partner died accidentally. Even more baffling proposals are that the 2 collaborated on a plan to go AWOL, forsaking their military obligations. Another possibility is that they were espionage agents for Japan. Perhaps the most attention-grabbing theory is that they were actually taken from their vessel by extraterrestrial involvement. One idea that hasn't been proposed yet is the supernatural explanation involving dimensional or temporal shifts. 3 years after the vanishing of the L8 pilots, 5 U.S. Navy torpedo bombers, known as Flight 19, departed from Fort Lauderdale. They departed Florida and never came back. The crew of those planes reported compass failures and confusion just before their last radio messages. Given that L8's radio was discovered to be functional and the pilots were aboard, why did they remain silent on the radio? Could electromagnetic interference have disrupted their signals? Might the Blimp's apparently inexplicable motion be due to a dimensional shift, especially since the men seemed to vanish? It traveled from above the Golden Gate Bridge to a location miles off, where it was observed floating into the clouds. Or could it even reappear with an extra person in the gondola? Does their potential dimensional travel resemble other folklore, like the 1954 case, where a man flew into Tokyo from an unrecognized nation named Taward? Afterward, he inexplicably vanished from a secured room while in Japanese police detention. Similarly to the pinpointed spots of legends like the Bermuda Triangle, could the Farallon Islands be such a place? These islands, also called the Devil's Teeth, might possess their own kind of supernatural effect. To this day, Ernest Cody and Charles Adams are not the only individuals who have mysteriously vanished. They vanished near the small rocky islands off San Francisco's coast. Jim Gray, a celebrated computer scientist who received the Alan Turing Award in 1998 for major contributions to global computing, is still remembered. Additionally, he was a seasoned sailor. On a clear, calm day in early 2007, he informed his family. His plan was to sail to the Farallon Islands to spread his mother's ashes. Just like Cody and Adams, he was never seen again. Similar to the case of the L.A. pilots, a thorough Coast Guard search covering almost 132,000 square miles yielded no results. Advanced sonar scans of 300 square miles of seabed between the Golden Gate Bridge and the islands revealed several shipwrecks. An underwater robotic camera verified that none of them was Jim's sailboat. This raises questions about why he didn't send a distress call if his boat had been wrecked.